At first, it was nothing but a rumor, a whisper in the halls of the African Union, a sealed letter, a powerful name signed at the bottom, Benjamin Netanyahu. But then came the shock. On a quiet evening, President Ibrahim Traoré stepped in front of the nation. No speechwriters, no flashing lights, just him holding a piece of paper that would rattle the corridors of power from Tel Aviv to Washington. This letter, he said, asks me to sell my people's dignity for $1.2 billion. I will not trade loyalty for bribes. What was supposed to remain a secret, a backdoor deal between Israel and Burkina Faso, had now been laid bare for the entire world to see. The deal: strategic aid, infrastructure projects, security partnerships, all in exchange for one thing: African silence. Israel hoped that one signature could stop the rising tide of African resistance to its policies. But Traoré didn't sign. He exposed it. And with that one act, everything changed. Within 24 hours, Africa is not for sale began trending across 14 countries. Student protests erupted. Governments began reviewing their ties to Israel. Artists painted murals. Elders spoke of dignity. Youths chanted of sovereignty. It wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. It was a continent waking up. And now we ask you, was Netanyahu's offer a strategic masterstroke or a desperate gamble? Should President Traoré have stayed quiet, or was this the only right path? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe Africa has the right to lead its own future, free from backdoor manipulation and foreign control, hit that like button and subscribe to Rise Up Traoré. Because this isn't just politics. This is the moment history refused to be bought. No one expected it to be real. Not at first. It began as a whisper inside the African Union headquarters. Just a rumor, the kind that dies quickly in the chaos of continental diplomacy. A sealed letter. A name scrawled at the bottom: Benjamin Netanyahu. But this time the rumor didn't disappear. It grew, and fast. Because the letter didn't land where it was supposed to. Somehow, through a series of quiet hands and silent gestures, it reached President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, the very man Israel hoped to neutralize. They called it the Reset Strategy, a carefully designed plan to rebuild Israel's influence across Africa, where its popularity had plunged in recent years, especially as Traoré's voice echoed across the continent, calling out Western imperialism and foreign double standards. The document, according to leaks, was meant to stay buried, pass through discreet channels, confirmed only by nods and handshakes. But what it contained was anything but ordinary. At the heart of the letter was an offer: $1.2 billion in strategic aid, infrastructure support, and enhanced regional security cooperation. On paper, it sounded generous, even noble. But beneath the polished wording was a simple demand: silence. Specifically, Traoré was asked to stop criticizing Israel's foreign policy in public and, if possible, convince other West African leaders to do the same. In exchange, Burkina Faso would receive an economic lifeline. No strings, just discretion, just quiet. But Traoré wasn't interested in quiet. Instead of replying in secret, he called a press conference. The entire country watched as he stood before the nation, not with anger, not with rage, but with something far more unsettling to power: calm resolve. In his hand was the letter. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He simply read, "This letter asked me to compromise my people's dignity for money, to stay silent while others dictate Africa's future, to act as if we are for sale." Let this be clear: Burkina Faso is not a subcontractor of foreign empires, and I will not trade loyalty for bribes. The room froze. So did the world. Within minutes, the broadcast was clipped, translated, and shared across the continent. In Accra, students gathered in front of parliament buildings with handwritten signs. In Lagos, radio hosts interrupted music to replay Traoré's words. In Dakar, a mural appeared overnight, the letter painted on a concrete wall with a red X across it. The message was unmistakable: Africa had heard, and it was paying attention. For Israel, this was a diplomatic disaster. The entire operation, months in planning, had unraveled in seconds. What was supposed to be a quiet realignment had become a public spectacle. Netanyahu's offer wasn't just rejected, it was weaponized. Inside Israel, sources close to the foreign ministry described the reaction as fury wrapped in disbelief. One official, speaking anonymously, admitted he turned a private agreement into a battlefield. But perhaps most surprising was how fast the regional reaction came. By the end of the day, several African governments had issued statements. Mali and Niger announced they were reviewing all Israeli-linked contracts. Chad recalled its ambassador from Tel Aviv. South Africa, already vocal in its criticism of Israel's actions in Gaza, praised Traoré's courage and urged others to follow suit. It was no longer a story about a single letter. It was about a continent drawing a red line. And the most powerful part, Traoré had never attacked Israel directly. He didn't call names. He didn't raise flags. He didn't burn effigies. He simply refused to be bought and made that refusal public. That silence, that refusal spoke louder than any rally or riot ever could. And yet this was only the beginning. Because if one leader could expose the hidden mechanics of foreign influence, what happens when others start doing the same? What happens when Africa begins to believe that dignity, not dollars, should define diplomacy? What happens when silence is no longer for sale? What began as a moment of defiance quickly escalated into something far larger, a continental reckoning. Within hours of Ibrahim Traoré's televised rejection of Israel's $1.2 billion offer, the political temperature across Africa began to rise. It wasn't just a soundbite, it was a spark, and the dry wood had been waiting. In Bamako, the capital of Mali, citizens gathered in city squares waving homemade signs that read, "Africa is not for sale." In Niamey, Niger's Minister of Foreign Affairs held a press conference declaring that all existing Israeli contracts would be reviewed. And in Chad, a bold and unexpected move, the ambassador to Tel Aviv was officially recalled. By midweek, 5 West African nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Togo, had agreed to convene an emergency summit. The stated purpose was clear: to investigate what they now called foreign influence operations disguised as investment. It was a phrase that resonated not just with governments, but with the people. In Ghana, university students launched a viral campaign called Our Dignity Matters, demanding that their government publicly disclose all foreign aid agreements made in the past 10 years. In Kenya, youth coalitions submitted open letters to the office of the president requesting full transparency regarding recent diplomatic meetings with Israeli and European officials. Everywhere, a new generation was rising, not with guns or protests, but with questions, with a quiet insistence that their future not be negotiated behind closed doors. And as these ripples grew into waves, Tel Aviv was already in panic mode. According to leaked cables from within the Israeli Foreign Ministry, the Netanyahu administration had suspended all informal diplomatic outreach to Burkina Faso and its immediate allies. One senior Israeli official was quoted off record saying, "He turned diplomacy into theater, and now we've lost control of the script." But to the people of Burkina Faso, it wasn't theater. It was truth spoken plainly. And just when international observers assumed the storm might subside, Traoré appeared again, this time without warning. He stood not on a national broadcast stage, but in front of a sea of students at the University of Bobo Dioulasso. No podium, no teleprompter, no soldiers, just a man in a worn-out olive jacket speaking directly to those whose futures were being bartered by distant hands. His voice was steady, his words unforgettable. We were told to stay quiet, to accept what's given, to say thank you when we're ignored. But now they come to us because they fear what happens when Africa wakes up. He paused, let the silence carry the weight, then asked, "So should we go back to silence or do we speak louder?" The crowd erupted. No chants, no slogans, just pure, thunderous affirmation. It was the sound of history shifting. From that moment, the issue was no longer just between Burkina Faso and Israel. It had become a rallying cry against any foreign power that treated Africa as a pawn, not a partner. In cities across the continent, murals began to appear, stylized images of the infamous letter, a bold red X marked across it. Artists in Abidjan painted portraits of Traoré holding a megaphone made of African flags. In Kinshasa, a spoken-word poet performed a piece titled "Not for Sale" that drew standing ovations for 3 nights straight. Meanwhile, in Europe and North America, mainstream media scrambled to frame the situation. Headlines like "Traoré escalates tensions with Israel and Burkina Faso risks isolation" dominated Western news cycles. But those narratives didn't hold in Africa, because on the ground the energy was different, proud, urgent, electric. This was not about diplomatic niceties. This was about a line that had finally been drawn publicly and unapologetically. For decades, foreign governments had relied on the idea that African silence could be purchased, that aid was enough to suppress criticism, that a photo op could erase years of exploitation. But Traoré had flipped the script, and in doing so, he revealed something that many in the global establishment had long feared: Africa is learning to say no. And worse, it's learning to say it out loud. In the days following Ibrahim Traoré's bold declaration, the aftershocks rippled far beyond diplomatic halls. Something deeper had been stirred, something more personal, more collective. It wasn't just about geopolitics anymore. It was about how people saw themselves. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, markets buzzed with conversation. Elderly vendors who once believed diplomacy was for the powerful and distant now debated foreign policy with urgency. Taxi drivers quoted Traoré's speech word for word. Barbershops echoed with phrases like "not for sale" and "let them fear our voice." The line between foreign affairs and daily life had been shattered. Mothers told their children, "This is what dignity looks like." Teachers rewrote their civics lessons overnight. Pastors and imams invoked Traoré's decision in sermons, linking it to moral courage and divine justice. It was as if the very idea of sovereignty, long treated as a dusty word in schoolbooks, had returned to life wearing the clothes of everyday people. But the changes didn't stop at culture. They cut deep into the political core. Opposition parties, often sidelined in Burkina Faso's military-led transition, found themselves grappling with a new political reality. They could no longer campaign on vague reforms or recycled foreign-backed platforms. The public, energized and newly alert, demanded clarity, demanded transparency, demanded loyalty to the people, not to donors. In the National Assembly, previously quiet sessions became charged. Lawmakers introduced emergency motions requiring full disclosure of all foreign aid agreements signed in the past decade. One representative speaking before the chamber asked plainly, if money comes with silence as a price, is it truly aid or is it submission? The debate spread beyond Burkina Faso. In Senegal, Ghana, Cameroon, and even as far south as Namibia, similar questions began surfacing. Student unions began petitioning their governments to release records of foreign contracts, particularly with nations that had been silent on African crises or complicit in extractive deals. A new political vocabulary was emerging. Terms like quiet colonization, economic obedience, and diplomatic dignity started appearing in public forums, op-eds, and youth manifestos. It wasn't just about Israel anymore. It was about every nation, Western or not, that had ever used aid as leverage. And most notably, this political fire didn't divide people. It unified them across class, religion, and even ethnicity. In a region often fractured by colonial lines and internal rivalries, something rare was happening: a shared clarity of purpose. The idea that Africa must define its terms of partnership rather than accept what's handed to it, and that scared a lot of people, especially outside Africa. International development agencies began scrambling to review their communication strategies. One EU official reportedly warned, if this spreads, we may face a trust collapse across multiple African countries. A leaked USAID memo recommended rebuilding influence through youth engagement and soft power media initiatives. They understood the danger, because once people question where the money comes from, they start questioning why it's needed at all. Once communities realize they've been bargaining with the illusion of generosity, they start renegotiating the entire system. But perhaps the most profound shift happened at the civic level. Young Africans, many of whom had grown up under regimes where speaking out was dangerous, now found themselves inspired by something rare: a leader who rejected power to protect principle. And in that, Traoré had redefined what leadership could look like. No longer just a strong man with medals and speeches, but a man who looked the world in the eye and said, "My people's dignity is not for sale." That sentence, repeated in whispers and painted on walls, began shaping how citizens saw their own responsibilities. If a president could reject billions for honor, then what excuse did they have to remain silent in the face of corruption? Citizen journalism spiked. WhatsApp groups once filled with gossip were now sharing investigative leads. Youth-run radio stations aired long-form discussions on foreign policy. Elders sat with teenagers to discuss the independence movements of the past, now suddenly alive again. It was in every sense a reawakening. One act of exposure, a single letter made public, had triggered the most unexpected revolution of all: a population no longer asking for leaders to represent them, but demanding to represent themselves. In Washington, the reaction wasn't televised, but it was intense. No official statement was issued, no press conference held. But inside the corridors of the State Department, the message was clear: something had shifted, and fast. A confidential briefing circulated within the National Security Council warned that the normalization of public rejection of aid for silence diplomacy could pose long-term risks to U.S. strategic influence in West Africa. The language was technical, but the meaning was obvious. Traoré had just opened a door others might walk through. the concern wasn't just about Israel's embarrassment, it was about precedent. For decades, Western powers, including the US, France, and the UK, had relied on carefully crafted aid packages and private diplomacy to maintain influence on the African continent. A school here, a military base there, an infrastructure grant attached to shared values. It had worked until now. Because if one African leader could take a deal, read it live on television, and reject it in the name of dignity, what would stop others, from Paris to Brussels? Intelligence memos began surfacing with a recurring phrase, risk of ideological contagion. Traore, once seen as a fringe figure, bold but manageable, had now triggered something none of them had predicted: emotional legitimacy. And in the world of geopolitics, emotion is more dangerous than strategy. In Tel Aviv, the Netanyahu government entered full damage control. Embassies were instructed to pause informal outreach to Burkina Faso and its allies. Back-channel talks with Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire were intensified in hopes of isolating Traoré diplomatically. But it was too late. The narrative had left the boardroom. It had entered the streets, the schools, the screens of millions across the global south. At the United Nations, some African diplomats began whispering of a new Sahel bloc, a coalition of nations prioritizing sovereignty over partnership, dignity over development contracts. And while no official proposal has surfaced yet, US and EU envoys have already begun lobbying behind closed doors to prevent such a formation. The fear is simple. If Africa finds its voice and refuses to sell it, the global order will have to listen. And for those who've spent decades writing the script of diplomacy in silence, the sound of truth spoken out loud may be the loudest threat of all. So now we're left with a question, one that won't be answered in headlines or handshakes. What happens when a continent once spoken over begins to speak for itself? What happens when a leader holds up a $1.2 billion offer, not to accept it, but to tear off the silence it came wrapped in? That's what President Ibrahim Traoré did. He didn't call for war. He didn't beg for approval. He simply reminded the world and his people that Africa's dignity was never meant to be traded. And that's why this moment matters. Because for too long, the story of Africa has been told through reports, conferences, and quiet corridors, where powerful nations made decisions on behalf of weaker ones, decisions measured not in lives, but in leverage. But what happens when the weaker ones decide they're no longer weak? That's what scares them. It's not the speech. It's the silence that follows. The uncomfortable silence of foreign offices, development banks, and media rooms suddenly unsure of their narrative. And here's what we must remember: this isn't about Burkina Faso alone. It's about the future of every nation who has ever been told, stay quiet, take the money, play your part. It's about Haiti, about Palestine, about the Congo, about native lands right here in the United States. It's about every place that was bought but never belonged. So now we ask you, was Traoré reckless or was he righteous? Was Netanyahu's offer diplomacy or desperation? And if Africa can say no today, can others say it tomorrow? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what you believe: Africa deserves dignity or deals. And if you're one of the few who still believes in unfiltered truth, in leaders who choose honor over handshakes, then this is your channel. Please like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who still thinks Africa is asking for permission to rise. Because what just happened wasn't a rejection, it was a declaration. And history, real history, begins here.